what I want to point out here is our law center does have priorities and objectives that we, in order to provide services, we ensure that these are the important issues that, or problems that we addressed. And if you see on this slide here, we have 4 priorities that we follow, which is for the first one. And I want to make sure that I provide you some concrete examples of how we do this. For the abuse and neglect priority, we monitor facilities and institutions on a periodic basis for abuse and neglect. We distribute educational materials and provide advocacy service for individuals who are allegedly being abused or neglected. And I personally do some of the monitoring, and we go out to the group homes to monitor these facilities. We also represent Native American children as guardian ad litem or youth attorney in child abuse and neglect cases in New Mexico and the Navajo Nation. And we also, or I personally, again, I monitor benefit use by those with representative payees to ensure that benefits are used to support beneficiaries. In the education realm, we promote self-advocacy. And the way we do that is we provide technical assistance to students with disabilities or their parents or guardians, as well as give training to parents to empower them to advocate for their children to obtain appropriate educational services. We also do systemic advocacy, which is we ensure that the Federal Bureau of Indian Education meets the educational needs of Native American students with disabilities enrolled in their schools by addressing the general education, special education, mental health, and wellness needs of students, including those impacted by trauma and adversity. And for the community integration, we promote self-advocacy for accommodations in public housing, and I'm talking about those for the Navajo Housing Authority and the Hopi Housing Authority. And in the employment area, how we do that is we provide awareness about the vocational rehabilitation services by producing outreach materials, training materials on employment opportunities. And so right now I work with the state of Arizona VR services, and we connect with some of the students on the Navajo Nation to provide them information so that when they leave the high school atmosphere, they're able to have information handy so that, or when they move on into adulthood, they have those vocational rehabilitation services and contact information. And also another service that we provide are referral services. We have the Benefits Enrollment Center where we assist those Native American elderly who are over 65 and adults that are over 21. And we assist them in identifying and applying for benefit programs such as Medicaid, Medicare, savings program, SNAP, just to name a few. But if you are interested in you're one of these people and you want to reach out to us, there are several ways you can do that. You can contact us. And I ask that our contact information be put in the chat box so that if you want to email us, you can do that. We also have our phone number listed on the last slide here, and my email address as well. Here's a slide of the statistics on disability. On an earlier session, Jim Warren mentioned that we do have the Native American communities do have a large percentage of disability individuals. So if you look at on this slide, and I only have the Navajo Nation disability status right now, but this is from the 2000 census data. At the bottom, you can see where we're getting this information, but I just wanted to point out here the large percentage, about more than 25% of the individuals on Navajo Nation between the 16 and 64 have a disability. And over 65 years of age, you can see that large amount of over 70% have a disability, and compare that to the larger population of American Indians and Alaska Native disability status, over 65 years of age. And this is an estimate, over 50% of our individuals across the nation have a disability. And this is, again, the sources at the bottom. It's from the 2010 US Census Bureau data. I also want to, and this term came up several times in the earlier presentation, the word tribal, or term tribal sovereignty. And I wanted to make sure that I explain how tribal sovereignty relates to the ADA and Section 504 laws. So to answer this question, what is tribal sovereignty? You need to first understand the legal concept of sovereignty in federal Indian law. And if you look up the word, that word or synonyms for the words are like independence, power, authority. It is the most fundamental idea within Indian law. And that is that tribes are sovereign governments. To be precise, tribes possess powers of self-government that exists long before the formation of the United States. So I wanted to give you some information about this term, and to give you some characteristics or attributes of what tribal sovereignty means. Tribal sovereignty is inherent, meaning that it exists independently from any delegation or any delegation by the federal government. Tribes are consequently separate sovereigns from the US and the states. So as a separate sovereign, a tribe is not subject to the restrictions of the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. However, tribes are subject to constraints under the Civil Rights Act and tribal statutes or constitutions that create a Bill of Rights for those under their governmental power or authority. Although tribes have inherent sovereignty, that independence is constrained or limited within the federal system. The Supreme Court held that, or recognized the term domestic dependent nations to describe the status of tribes. The idea is that tribes sought out the protection of the United States by entering into treaties with it. And in doing so, tribes indirectly lost the full sovereignty they previously possessed. And so I point this out because it does relate to, or might not relate, it depends on where, it would depend on the tribal communities laws, to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the Americans with Disability Act is a federal law. It prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of public life. And that includes schools, transportation, and public and private places that are open to the general public. And the purpose of the law is to make sure that people with disabilities have the same rights and opportunities as everyone else. It guarantees equal opportunity for individuals with disabilities in public accommodations, employment, transportation, state and local government services. And if you look further at this, ADA Act, in Title III of the ADA Act, there's the term private entity, and it defines it as anything other than a public entity. So it covers everything from zoos to auditoriums. The emphasis here is on private operations and not government operations. If you noticed, if you noticed now that I've read these statutes to you, it doesn't say anything about tribes, tribal communities, Indian lands, or Native Americans, Indians. So I want to point out here and also make sure that I explain to you that the ADA federal law does not apply to tribal communities. So this is just something for you to think about, and something for you to think about that you don't want to assume that this ADA applies to all tribes. So in general, and this applies to, and this is for all tribal communities, there isn't an assumption that the ADA applies. Usually under federal law, there must be a specific reference that a federal statute applies to tribal communities. And here, if we just gone over the ADA, and if you notice, the ADA does not have that, that information, or it doesn't point to anything about Indian tribes. So the rule or default rule is that there's not a private right of action in federal court. So generally the ADA does not apply. However, there is an exception. It depends on whether the tribe either, one, adopts it, or two, if they have a provision stating so. For example, if a tribal nation has a provision that says you can bring claims under federal law in that tribal community's court, then one could possibly sue that tribe under the federal ADA or Section 504 in that tribe's court and under their tribal law. So I just wanted to point out the bottom line is that the ADA does not apply to all tribal communities. And this goes back to the concept of tribal sovereignty in creating and allowing to be able to self-govern themselves. So I just wanted to point that out. And also the last slide here, I believe I missed, but it's Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. What I wanted to point out here on this statute is that although it says that it prohibits discrimination against individuals with a disability by programs receiving federal financial assistance. And under this statute, program includes the reference to Indian tribes, which has an agreement with the state to provide vocational services. So now I want to transfer the remaining time to Hosky Benali, and he's going to give you more information about some of the initiatives that we've been working on and the legislative
Annette?
history of the disability laws. Yes.
Annette, do you have just a moment for like a couple questions from the chat?
Actually, can we leave the questions for the end?
Sure thing. Thank you.
Thank you. And Hosky, I'm going to transfer the floor over to you now. And we have the Navajo Nation Disability Legislative History slide up for you.
Okay, thank you, Annette. I'd like to say thank you again, and I recognize a lot of the names of participants there. Going in and out of the meeting, I want to say hello to them. Like I mentioned earlier, in addition to being the community government liaison with the Native American Disability Law Center, which basically my responsibilities is to work with the Navajo government and the issues and needs of Navajo disabilities. In addition to that, I've been the president of the Navajo Nation Advisory Council on Disabilities for probably over 10 years. Back in 1979, there was an affirmative action plan that was put in place and passed by the Navajo Nation Council. And so that's 42 years ago. And at that time, what that affirmative action plan spoke to was about equal employment for Navajos with disabilities. It also talked about public building accessibility, whether that was private or public buildings. In other words, government buildings or even businesses on the Navajo Nation. At that time, too, that affirmative action established the Navajo Nation Advisory Council on Disabilities. And this Navajo Nation Advisory Council is basically the official advocacy body for individuals with disabilities on the Navajo Nation. And we're under also the auspices and work closely with the with Paula Sinez and her organization, also especially at Rehabilitation Services. Members of the advisory council, we have 10 members, and which includes individuals with disabilities, parents of individual disabilities, and service providers. And each member is confirmed by the office of the Navajo president. So that's how this advisory council was established. So that's back in 1979. So next slide. What do we have? 2005.
Hosky, you have the issues affecting Navajos with disabilities. You want to start with the Navajo transit system.
No, that history, I haven't given the complete history yet. I think there's one that says 2005 education. Is that still there?
I apologize.
Okay.
I apologize. Let me take it back here. Okay, so you have affirmative action plan of 1979.
Right, talked about that. Next.
Navajo Education and Sovereignty Act of 2005.
Okay, that act there, that was in 2005. So you got 1979 all the way to 2005. And in that act there, it basically strengthened the affirmative action plan from 1979 and against discrimination in the areas of housing, employment, training, social services, medical services, in participation in the cultural, social, political, and economic activities of the Navajo Nation. That they said that if, despite a person with a disability, they will not be discriminated against. So that law strengthened the 1979. In addition to that, there was a law that came forth, a mandate was called Vocational Rehabilitation and Opportunities Act for the Handicapped. And that law spelled out about how private and public billing, public and private entities were all mandated to provide public accessibility to their organization as well. And this is structural, as well as providing reasonable accommodations, and also about policies. So, but so that established that part then. So we'll go next slide. I think it's the executive order of 2014 by former President Ben Shelley. And so what happened was in 2014, when former President Ben Shelley was in office, there was really not much movement as far as the Navajo Nation complying or addressing the needs and issues of Navajo disabilities. So President Shelley put out an executive order. And in that executive order, he mandated that all Navajo departments and divisions look at their policies. If they didn't have any policies as how they're going to serve Navajos with disabilities, they don't have any policies as far as how they're going to provide reasonable accommodations and accessibility to their buildings, then they needed to either develop one or to upgrade that policy that they had, because policies can be a real barrier in serving Navajos with disabilities in any capacity. Even out there in the federal government also has that policy, that the policies cannot become barriers. So he put that out. Then we go down to the current law. Out of all that, then stems this new law called the Navajo Nation Navajo Nation Civil Rights for Individuals with Disabilities. What that came out of was the other law that I mentioned earlier, the Navajo Vocational Rehabilitation or the Handicap Act. When we started talking about non-compliance of private and public entities, and we were basically talking there about the Business Site Lease Act of 2005 and Navajo Nation. And we were saying that all leases go through the Navajo Nation Economic Development. But within those lease agreements, it didn't mention anything about how businesses that were given business site leases would be, how they would comply with reasonable accommodation, site accessibility, and policies. It mentioned it, but there was no verbiage of compliance. There was no consequences, no legal consequences. So then this law, the Civil Rights Act, then came into play. And so the Civil Rights Act then gives individuals with disabilities the right to sue the Navajo Nation government. If they feel that they've been discriminated against, they can expect legal and equitable outcomes for being discriminated against. And it mentions a whole number of areas, again, housing, education, training, social services, all those things that Navajo people need, as well as that all Navajo Nation entities, government entities, are to make sure that they have the availability of services for Navajos with disabilities. So that came out of that. Now, earlier, I mentioned that ADA basically, for the most part, doesn't apply on the Navajo Nation, within the Navajo Nation. So when you read this Civil Rights for Individuals Act of 2018, it follows a lot of the mandates of the ADA. although you don't mention when you look at the Civil Rights Act, it follows it. There's talks about the accessibility for housing, accessibility for voter rights, talks about education. It talks about services to be rendered to all people with disabilities as well as the public. Even mentions in there about that those that are incarcerated, that they are to receive their rights as a person with disabilities as well as reasonable accommodation. So it goes into have that before, but detention centers or the law center, the Native American Soul Law Center now goes in there and does monitoring to make sure that inmates are able to receive their rights, make sure that they're being treated fairly, and making sure that there's no mistreatment of because that their intention that they have a disability. So the Civil Rights Act then covers pretty much ADA, a lot of the mandates from the American Disabilities Act. It covers that. Okay, so that's how we, in a way, I guess, get around the sovereignty issue that ADA doesn't apply on the Navajo Nation. So that's how that was put into place. Next, what do we have? We have the 3 laws, right? Did we skip the 3 laws?
Husky, the next slide is titled Issues Affecting Navajos with Disabilities. And the first bullet point, you have Navajo Transit System.
Okay. Let me just mention real quickly, there are 3 laws, disability laws, basically with the Navajo Nation. I just talked about the Civil Rights Act. But there's another law called the Vulnerable Adult Protection Act that was passed probably around 2012. And what was happening there was that there was no mandates, legal mandates on the Navajo Nation for the age group between 16 to 64 for protection. There was an early, hold on. Excuse me, my phone was interrupting me. But so there was an Early Childhood Protection Act from 0 to 18, and then there was a Elderly Protection Act, but there was no protection for those between that age group of 18 to 64. So against abuse, neglect, exploitation, and abuse, exploitation, and abandonment. And so when you got to the court system, there was nothing to protect. So the Navajo Nation Rights Council Disabilities and the American Disability Law Center drafted legislation for that. The Law Center provides a lot of legal technical assistance to the Navajo Advisory Council. So that law was then passed. And then the next one that came along was the Guardianship Act. And what was happening there was that if a person had received guardianship, somebody had received guardianship over them, they would lose all their rights as far as where they're going to live, their financial income, where they're going to go to school, where they're going to receive medical services. So that law there basically talked about the fact that people with disabilities do still have, despite their disability, have the ability to make decisions for themselves. So in that act, then it gave back the responsibilities to be decided by the court system, how much of those would be maintained by the person with a disability and how much would be charged with the guardian, so that because some of them were unable to make complete decisions for themselves. So, but it still gave the person with disability decision-making authority. So that act went into place again. So those are, and then the Civil Rights Act. So those were the three acts. Now, on the Navajo Nation, we're addressing right now through the Law Center, through OSHERS, and through the Navajo Advisory Council. Because Navajo Advisory Council is basically charged with identifying the needs and issues of Navajos with disabilities, as well as coming up and bringing that forth into the Navajo Nation government and working with the executive, legislative branches of the Navajo Nation government. In our plan of operation, it gives us the authority, the advisory council, to work with all these three entities of the Navajo Nation government, and that's why we're able to bring these bring forth these legislations that I mentioned earlier. So one of the things that we're working on right now, probably over the last 10 years, is a Navajo transit system. The Navajo transit system provides buses and public transportation throughout the Navajo Nation. And 10 years ago, we cited them with the fact that a lot of the buses did not have wheelchair lifts. And so we began to work with them on ensure that their buses were equipped with wheelchair lifts. So what they did was, as the fleet, because the buses usually, the lifespan is about 4 to 5 years. So every time they bought new buses, they were charged with the obligation to have these buses with wheelchair lifts on. And then the state of New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah Departments of Transportation donated bus shelters to be placed along the bus routes. And so right now we're still working on that because in the Navajo Nation, there's still right-of-way issues. And so, but these bus shelters were to be placed on the bus routes, cement slab, so that they can lower the wheelchair lifts down onto those slabs, and then the shelter, people waiting while they're waiting for the buses. So we're still working on those. About a year ago, we talked with Navajo Transit System. They're saying 80% of their buses are wheelchair equipped with wheelchair lifts. So we're still, but 80% that's real high, but they're also up in Utah. I just want to mention that bus routes were discontinued for a while. And so a lot of the people with disabilities use those bus routes to get to the Shiprock or other places where there are hospitals, grocery stores, social services, and they use that transportation a lot to get to these places that they need to get to. Okay, so what's next?
You have the Navajo Election Administration. Okay,
Navajo Election Administration. We've been working with them now for about 10 years. And then the Navajo Civil Rights says that all Navajo disabilities are to have access to polling sites, as well as access to be able to register to vote. And so in 2012, the Law Center and then the OSHERS and the Advisory Council did a survey of 15 polling sites throughout the Navajo Nation, or 25. And Navajo Nation has 5 different agencies. And so in each agency, we did 5 and surveyed these polling sites. There was only 2 that came out, like one that had a steep ramp, and then another one had a doorknob instead of a C shape, but all the others were very inaccessible. The parking lot, we surveyed the parking lot all the way into the polling sites, and the parking lots were rocky, sandy, inclement weather where you would hardly be able to push a wheelchair, or people with walkers and people with visual impairment. And then inside it would get pretty congested. So we're still working with the Navajo Election Administration on that part of it. And we've also brought to the attention that the Central Navajo Election Administration Office in Window Rock is upstairs. Those are familiar with Window Rock, the Quality Inn, that restaurant, and where there's a motel. They rent from them, and there is no elevator out to that office. So if somebody that can't climb stairs for one reason or another because of their disability have to wait downstairs and have somebody come to them. And this is outside. So we brought that to their attention, and they're saying that they were getting new land to build a new building. So we're still working on that. Next.
You have the Navajo Housing Authority.
Okay, Navajo Housing Authority. We also did a survey in 2012 also about, we did surveys of 2,000 individuals, focus groups, and also surveys that they sent in. And their biggest concern with Navajo disability was lack of housing. And so we've been working with Navajo Housing Authority over the last 10 years also. And so out of this survey, people were talking about the fact that it's hard to get housing, that there's not enough accommodating units. And so people with disabilities on the Navajo Nation basically are taken care of by their relatives, and they live with their relatives. And so they end up in nursing homes and other congregate settings, and they don't need to be there. So we're still working on that with them about how we're going to make sure that there's enough accommodating for those with disabilities. So that's another issue that we're working on. Next.
You have the Emergency Disability Management Plan.
The Emergency Management Plan, we're just beginning to work on. Because of COVID really kind of spurred this. And then every winter time, a lot of the weather is real bad, especially out in the rural remote areas. It's real muddy, it gets real snowy, impassable. So what we want to look into is, does the Navajo Emergency Preparedness Plan include people with disabilities? What does it say about it? And what can we do about it? So we're just beginning to work on this now. But that's another issue that we one of our other initiatives that we have. Next.
You have disability employment.
Okay, disability employment. For a long time, the Navajo Nation personnel manual did not have anything in there as to how they're going to consider people with disabilities for employment with the Navajo Nation government, as well as how they're going to provide reasonable accommodations. So we've met with Navajo Nation HR department about a year and a half ago. It's right before COVID set in. And we provided them some recommendations of policies when they put in their personnel manual when it comes out again, so they can address that, making sure that Navajo disabilities have the opportunity to be considered for employment with the Navajo Nation. We also did a survey of a number of public and private entities on the Navajo Nation. Navajo Nation has a number of enterprises. They have gas and oil, they have the Navajo Agricultural Product Industries, Navajo Tribal Utility Authority, Navajo Arts and Crafts. And then so we surveyed them. We asked, the question is, do you consider people with disabilities for employment? Do you actively recruit people with disabilities for employment? Does your policies and procedures have policies in there about how you're going to consider them and provide reasonable accommodations? Has your administration received any training in working with people with disabilities? And at that time, the Civil Rights Act just came out. And are you aware that there's a Civil Rights Act? We surveyed 21, we made phone calls, we only got 9 responses. the others never called us back. But out of the 9, a lot of them did not have or couldn't answer the question to say, yes, we do. The only ones, because their fellow entities was IHS, was one in the BIA because of legal mandates that we were following. So you can see that we really have a lot of work to do in that area of education. So those are the initiatives that we have that we're working on now. And so just want to share with you, I think my suggestion, I think with other tribes and talking with, I'm also in Joseph Ray, who's, I keep hearing his name here, in and out of the meeting. But my brother, he's the chairperson for the subcommittee on disabilities at the National Congress of American Indians. And so I know we know that a lot of them do have advocacy groups within your tribes, but it's a lot better if you can somehow become part of the government. If you can have your tribal council acknowledge an official advocacy body for disability within the Navajo Nation. Because otherwise, you're just an advocacy group basically looking in to the government. You really don't have any leverage. So that's my suggestion, that those with disabilities, those groups, try to get official acknowledgement and have a plan of operation within your tribal government to be able to have more leverage in how you're going to address the needs and issues of people with disabilities. So that's what I have, and I will give you some ideas. So that's our systems advocacy that I mentioned earlier. That's what we're involved in, and we're also involved with some degree with the Hopis. So that's my presentation. I'd like to say thank you, and be glad to answer any questions. Back over to Nat.
Hosky, I just wanted to mention that you were saying we do other advocacy work with other tribes. Which act have we made a model? We actually shared is it the Vulnerable Adult Protection Act with other tribes to use as a model? Was that the Hopi community?
Yeah, they're using the same one in Hopi. They're trying to get that passed, but if anybody wants a copy of that, we'll be glad to share that with you. We'll be glad to share the Guardianship Act with you and the Civil Rights Act. Right now, there's a big push towards supportive decision-making. And so we have an annual conference with the Advisory Council. And for the last year and a half, we didn't have it because we had it scheduled and then COVID hit. So this year, what we're going to do is KTNN Radio out of Window Rock. We're going to provide presentations on various disability needs and issues. And so we'll be doing that somewhere in May. The topics that we have to support decision making. We're going to also have substance abuse as a disability, talking about parental advocacy. How do you do that? Education, as far as special education on with the BIE. So we'll have several topics being covered. And what we do is one hour, maybe on a Monday, Wednesday, and another on Monday. So we're working with getting that finalized, and then that's going to be aired with through KTNN. So that's what we're working on also. So
okay, thank you, Hosky.
There were a number of questions, and we only have less than a minute to address them. But someone asked, can you speak to the most common form of disability in the 65-plus-year-old Navajo population?
I don't know right now. because one of the things that we were in the process of doing was we're gonna do focus groups. We sent out an RFP for somebody to come in and help us to identify what are the prevalent disabilities on the Navajo Nation. And so we have an RFP that's still out there. And so if anybody is interested in that, call OSHA's Office of Special Rehabilitation Service and talk to Amanda Williams. But we haven't got that information and we really need that information.
Okay. And one quick question. Some states are starting to pass laws that create procedural safeguards so that parents with disabilities do not face discrimination in child welfare and family court cases. Have any other similar safeguards been created for tribal child welfare programs?
I'll let Nat answer that.
Well, I can't. I think I can't confidently say, speaking for the Law Center, but I can point out the Indian Child Welfare Act. I know that our Law Center and several disability organizations in New Mexico are working together. But for this individual asking this question, if you would contact us and maybe we'll get more information for you. You can do that by visiting our website or emailing us, and we can give you more information about that and maybe involve some of our other staff members to remark on that as well. Thank you.